Good evening. Good evening. I want to welcome you all to the SCI-Arc Spring Lecture Series on behalf of the Undergraduate Lecture Committee. I know that many of you this evening may have been expecting Daniel Libeskind. Unfortunately, he had to go to Europe and has rescheduled his lecture for March 17th at 8 p.m. here in this space. A few brief notes. We also have a Friday afternoon or Friday noon lecture series. We have two coming up. One this Friday with Hideo Horaki, who is a Japanese architect and has done quite a bit of work in Nagasaki. And on March 10th, Jane Weinstock, who's a filmmaker, will be showing her recent film here as well. Next week's lecture will be Ernie Gare, Film and Architecture, Urban Spaces and Spaces of the Mind. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce one of my professors, a professor I met during my time here at SCI-Arc 2.5 years ago in Vico, in the program that we have there in Switzerland. In 1968, the world caught fire. Milan, Chicago, Paris, Berkeley, Prague, Detroit, New York, Kent State, Rome, and campuses around the world. The leaders of that time empowered us. They were not necessarily our elders by being another generation, but just a few years older than us for the most part. They created a world that, for those of us preparing for college at the time, was not a world to be feared or conquered, but a world that was changed and a world that was very vibrant. One of the leaders of that event, of that change, was our speaker tonight, Bruno Queysanne. One of the things that still remains from all of those fires is a fire of passion. And this is one of the things that I've learned about Bruno in the 2.5 years that I've known him. He speaks about architecture and architecture history from a very different perspective. He comes to us as a philosopher, and the way he views buildings and the built environment I have found to be one that is very refreshing. And during the course of that time, Bruno touched on certain themes that were close to my own heart. Last fall, as I was working on my own thesis here, Bruno and I had a short conversation on the topic of myth and its role in creating transcendent place. Out of that conversation, Bruno supported me and gave me some pointers along the way. I'd like to read a brief quote from one of the letters that Bruno wrote to me. I like this provocative encounter of the most traditional with the most contemporary. Just remember that maybe modernity is nothing else than tradition at the moment of its birth. Please welcome Bruno Queysanne.
As a philosopher, I need books. So thank you very much for inviting me tonight. Well, I was preparing myself to discuss this issue of mythology and contemporary architecture with a small group of friends around John Buchanan, and I am here in front of you. So it's a bit difficult. Mythology and contemporary architecture. Why mythology? Why could we use mythology to better understand architecture. Because since millenaries, some millenaries, since the time of Plato in classical Greece, some centuries before Christ, we have divided logos and topos, so the concept and the place. And now the problem is to reconnect them, because when we want to use the pure logos, the pure logic, the pure concept, in order to understand the specificity of the place, we transform the place in something that the logos can master, can study. The logos transform things in objects. The logos select among the variety of the world, select some point that he transforms in object that he makes of its own. Doing that, it loses the logos, or we, using the logos, we lose a lot of features of the topos, of the sensible world. And philosophers, after Plato, who was the first to set that strong difference in between logos and topos, a lot of philosophers, being aware of the fact that it's not satisfying to abandon so much features of the reality in order to think it with the logos, they try to find something in between, which would belong to the world of the logos on one hand, and to the world of the topos, of the space, the place, on the other one. For instance, Immanuel Kant, end of 18th century, which was really one who strongly organized the difference in between the concept and the intuition of the sensible world, said, well, the concept without intuition are empty, and intuition without concept are blind. But it's a very difficult task to connect them, concept and intuition. And he proposed something very difficult, very sophisticated, that he called schematism. To use something, the scheme, which on a certain way is abstract, not from the sensible world, but at the same time belongs to it. So in between the concept and the space, the place. But he said the schematism is the most difficult part of my philosophy, and to really understand what it is something which is deeply hidden into the heart of nature, of the world. Maybe mythos, the myth, is something like that, in between the pure logos and the pure topos. It belongs to the same civilization, to the same Greek civilization. And usually, historians of philosophy, of theory, they conceive mythology as a first form of thinking belonging to the childhood of humankind. When we are young, we think with myth. But when we become adult, we think with logos. As if mythos would have been a first step towards the domination, the triumph of the logos. In fact, if we go back to the actual Greek civilization, it's not so simple. And there is a very fascinating paradox in that the philosopher who the first set the strong difference in between logos and topos, in between what is correctly thinking and not correctly thinking, Plato himself, was not only using myth in his work, but even creating myth. That means the first who tried to not to invent, but to discover the pure logic of the logos was forced to nevertheless use the potentiality of mythology. And precisely in one of his dialogues, Timaeus, in which we are told the story of the creation of the universe, of the world in which we are dwelling. And the entire dialogue, we could say, is a myth about the creation of the world invented by Plato. But why? Why could he propose to understand the world a pure logos instead of a myth? It's because when we face or we are confronted to think the sensible world, the universe in which we are, well, we have some problem, because I would say the pattern of thought which are defining the logos are not fitting the object, which is the world. Because the world, the created world, has some features which escape to the possibility of the logos. And he said himself that he proposed something like an explanation about the creation of the world. Something like an explanation, but not a real explanation. So not a real logos, but what he called an eikos logos. Eikos, so E-I-K-O-S. K-O-S, not chaos. E-I-K-O-S. Eikos, logos. Eikos in Greek means probable, plausible, in difference with the certitude of the truth. Vraisemblable in French, and maybe you can have that in English. Vraisemblable means similar to the truth, from the Latin vero simile. So this eikos logos is precisely the mythos, the myth. The myth is not a pure logos, is an eikos logos. Probable. What says the myth is not certain. It's maybe possible to consider it as something similar to the truth, but not being the truth. Why? Why are we forced to use these eikos logos instead of the pure logos? Because in the conception of Plato, the real, true reality belongs only to the world of the ideas, in the heaven. In heaven, you have the pure ideas. And in Greek, it's the same word which means idea and form and shape, eidos. The logos is appropriate to point, I would say, the logic of this world of pure ideas. But the world in which we are living is not the pure heaven. We know that. We are not living in the heaven. We are on the ground, just on the surface of the ground. And the ground, the earth, the universe, is just a copy. It has been created by a little God as a copy of the real, true world of the ideas. So what we call reality, what is our own reality, the space, the topos, is just but a copy of the truth. And so Plato said, the logos is appropriate to the true truth, I would say, of the ideas, but to think the creation, the world as created as a copy of the pure ideas, we have to find a new pattern of thought, which is this eikos logos, similar to the truth, but not to the truth. Why? Because the ideas belong to something which is timeless, eternity. So no change, no corruption, no corrugation of things within the heaven. But here, on the earth, we are submitted to time, and time is the great corrupter, is the great actor of changement. On the earth, in our world, things are permanently changing. And the logos is appropriate to grasp the meaning of the ideas, which are true for eternity. So they cannot grasp the meaning of the things which are permanently changing. When you say, well, it's raining, it's true maybe for some times, but the rain is stopping and then the sunshine is coming. So we cannot assert forever a truth about the sensible world, the world in which we dwell. And the logos, the mythos, the myth, as an eikos logos, as a probable logic, plausible, verosimilar, but not quite similar to the truth, is appropriate to that. We cannot say the truth about the world, so either we give up, because we know that the world created is not the world of the pure truth, or we try to find something to help us to understand the context in which we are living. And that, at the level very abstract of the question of the mythology, I guess is very precisely one of the difficulty of thinking architecture. Since, I would say, some years, we have tried to, in order to help us to understand architecture, to use a paradigm that we import from science of nature or human sciences. So we reduce the top of the architectural place in something which can be studied by the science of the engineer or the science of the sociologist. But remember the triad by Vitruvius, firmitas, firmness, solidity, so technical structure of the thing, architectural thing, with commoditas, utilitas, the function, utility, and the third features, venustas, beauty, delight. There is no science for delight, for beauty. So either we reduce architectural space to something which is not the entire reality of it, that is, we cut the third dimension, which is the venustas, and we consider only architecture as a technical object or a functional object. And then we can use the pure logos. But if we want to keep the entire world of qualities of the architectural space, we are forced to think differently than the way science does. And that's why I propose, not to give up for the task to think architecture, which has been a possibility taken by some people saying, well, it's the indicible, you know. This architectural quality of the architecture is something which escapes from description, from language, so we cannot say it. And you remember this statement by Wittgenstein at the end of his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus: what you cannot tell, shut up. You know? So if we cannot tell these sensible, aesthetical, delightful quality of architecture, are we condemned to not to speak about it and to consider that it's gone forever out of the domain of science? I don't want to give up from the task of thinking architecture, and I don't want to reduce it as an object that the pure logos could master. Also, it's a question of the truth which is at stake in that discussion. A discussion of the truth coming from the Greek also. Plato, in a certain way, considering that the logos is what it is fitting the features of the ideas, is considering the process of finding the truth as a process of adequation. You know, you are, with your logos, with your discourse, with your series of concepts, you fit precisely, you know, you adhere to the thing that you are thinking. It's the truth considered in Latin as adequatio intellectus ad rem, to the thing, you know. And so you can have a discussion of the precision, you know, of the fitting of your concept, of your intellection to the thing itself. And it is precise or not, you fit or not. But the first conception of the truth in Greece has a name, aletheia, which is a double negation. The truth for the Greek, I would say, before Plato, before the conception of the truth as adequatio, of precision, of correspondence, was this double negation. Why? Because in aletheia you have A, which is the mark of the negation. And negation of what? Of lete, letheia, lete, which is oblivion. Oblivion. So the truth for the first Greek was the negation of the oblivion which is a negation when things are forgotten. So the truth, rather being a pure overlapping of and precise of the concept and the thing, was a kind of process, a process during which you strive to not forget, you know. It was a performance that you have to reenact permanently, which was considerably different than the new conception of the truth as adequation, because when the truth in that new theory has been discovered, it's forever, you know. If it is true forever, because you have taught, you have been in connection with the pure ideas. The idea, they don't change. You discover the theory of the numbers, like Pythagoras, etc., and that's forever. But when you were a Greek before that new conception, the truth was never gained forever. You had permanently to come back and to work and to negate this negation, which is the oblivion. So it was very fragile, you know, the truth of the aletheia is never established. It's an establishment. I mean, it would be a process of establishing, but never an established position. Another difference in between mythos, the myth, and the logos, I guess, interests the thinking of architecture. The mythos as something probable, plausible, in a certain way is auto-referential. I mean, the truth of the mythos, of the myth, is just valuable when you perform it. And it's within that performance, when you tell the myth, when you tell the story, which is the content of the myth, that the myth is telling something like a truth. The authority which had the myth belong to the myth itself, to the discourse itself. On the contrary, the logos, has an adequation to the pure world of the ideas, is a pure servant, I would say, toward the truth. So the authority of the logos, in a certain sense, is absolute, because it comes not from itself, but from outside of itself, from the purity of the pure world of the ideas. In a certain sense, the logos, you cannot discuss it. Take it or leave it, The mythos is not at all in that condition, because it has to convince, to try to say something about things which are changing. So it's only when I tell the myth that the myth has something true in it. When I don't say it, when I don't tell it, there is nothing. So that means that the myth, if we give some credit to it, it's only because we are wishful thinking towards it. The myth is the product, in a certain way, of a social or collective agreement. It's a kind of convention, We agree to consider that discourse about that or that is more or less correct, valuable. And if we don't accept this agreement, we are not forced to respect what says the myth, which is not possible in the case of the logical discourse, the discourse of the logos. In that case, either you accept the logic of the logos or you refuse it, but if you refuse it, you are outside the world of knowledge. If you accept the process, the logical process of the logos, you have no discussion possible. The authority is absolute because it is not our authority on ourselves. It's an authority which came, depending to your philosophy, coming from laws of nature, or from God, or from some basic principle. In relation to it, we are in a very weak position. In the mythos world, we are the masters, gentle masters, not with an absolute power, because our power, or the power of our discourse depends only on the capacity of convincing the other to accept my discourse by a kind of agreement. And think about the question of architecture. We had so many theory about architecture telling us what is architecture, and you accept or you refuse, you belong to that school or not. kind of absolute authority of the logical discourse about architecture, or something else, which could be a permanent experimentation of what on which we agree, a kind of conventional. And that echoes, and that makes, I would say, in a certain sense, the difference of architecture in confrontation with all the other arts. We have considered for centuries, millenaries, art as imitation of nature, imitation of principle, imitation of truth, of ideas. Because in painting, for instance, we had in front of us the model to imitate. It was the nature for landscape, it was the human body, the face for portrait, etc. We had something like the idea in the Plato's philosophy. We have a contact with the idea, which has a form, a shape, and we try to imitate it. In the case of architecture, the theory of art as imitation, art not only as artistic art, but even technical art, does not work. Because when we do architecture, when you do a project, what are you imitating? What is the model of your project? Where is this model? What is the shape of this model? That was one of the big questions that rose Heidegger, at what the image of what the Greek temple is built. Yes, we have the temple, the Greek temple, but at the imitation of what? And so the poor architects, were abandoned, I would say, by the model. The nature does not give the model for architecture. What to do? If we are not imitating something, we are not considered as being an art. And if we are an art, what is the form? Where is the model? So, to solve that question, they invent a myth, the myth of the primitive hut. Long time ago, they build something. They plant, they make standing vertically 4 pillars, and on these they put horizontal beams, and on top of that a triangular pediment, etc., etc. So it's a story, it's a kind of myth. But which are the fragility of the myth? It's not sure. But if we want to consider architecture as an art with the same value that the society gives to painting, sculpture, etc., we have to find somewhere a model. Reality, history, nature, not giving that model, we have to invent it. And to make an agreement, a kind of convention, to accept a myth, a story, a tale, as the thing that we imitate. You see how fragile is this process of thinking compared to mathematics or even painting, which are, for mathematics, in the heaven in which you have the pure ideas, you have the theory of the numbers that we have just to unveil, we have to have a kind of inspiration, direct contact, and we have the theory. We don't invent, we just discover. Same thing for all the other arts. They have their model in front of us, of them. In architecture, not. So we are forced to invent a kind of convention. Obviously, through the ages, we change the content of that convention. But the agreement that we can have in architecture is only based on that fragile reality of the myth, discourse of the myth. So, eikos logos, I told you. But if we take in consideration the sensible world, because when we are dealing with architecture, we are obliged to do with the sensible. The idea is not giving us a model, we are obliged to invent and to dwell in the process of making a project into the sensible world. And it's not easy to accept that in the sensible world there is something like a logic, something like a discourse, which relates nevertheless things and permits us to develop a kind of demonstration, argumentation. And I would like to quote the French actor and playwright Antonin Artaud in his wonderful text, The Theatre and Its Double, from the 30s, in which he will discover a logic being something which rules communication, which rules the reason to be together and to exchange. To exchange what? Not logical concept, but nevertheless some meaning. And it happens to him during the performance in Paris in the 30s of Balinese theater, a show of traditional theater from Bali. And so he didn't know the language, the music, the content of the show. Nevertheless, something happened. In fact, the strange thing about all these gestures, these actors performing, these angular, sudden, jerky postures, these syncopated inflections form at the back of the throat, these musical phrases cut short, the shorted flights, rustling branches, hollow drum sounds, robot creaking, animated puppet dancing. It's the feeling of a new bodily language, no longer based on words, but on signs which emerges through the maze of gestures, posture, cries, etc. But in a language to which we no longer seem to hold the key. And by language, I do not mean an idiom we fail to catch at first hearing, but precisely that kind of theatrical language, foreign to every spoken language, where it seems a tremendous stage experience is recaptured, beside which out exclusively dialogue productions, or beside which, or exclusively dialogue productions seem like so much stammering. And this show has the solemnity of a holy ritual. The hieratic costumes give each actor a kind of dual body, dual limbs. And in this costume, the stiff, stilted artist seems merely his own effigy. Beside the booming, pounding musical rhythm, there is a sustained, hesitating, fragile music, which seems to green the most precious metals, where springs of water bubble up as in a state of nature, where columns of insects march through the plants, where the sound of light itself appears to have been picked up, where the sounds of deep solitudes seem distilled into crystal swarms. All creativity stems from the stage in this drama, finding its expression and even its sources in a secret psychic impulse, speech prior to words. So that would mean there is a logic into that sensible world, into that world which is considered as missing of logical meaning, because Artaud couldn't share the formal institutional meaning of the show, because he does not partake anything with the Balinese culture. And nevertheless, a lot of things happen to him. He could be connected. That means that beside, underneath, underground, or beyond, there is a possibility for a logic of pure shapes, not a logic of eidos idea, but logic of pure shape. And if we succeed in grasping that level of communication, that level of logic which is not quite logical, I guess we open the way to understand architecture. So, to complete, I would say, if I may, Wittgenstein, what we cannot say, okay, don't try to say it, or don't give up to understand it. But let's find a different way to communicate with it. And just to give you examples of what it is possible to do with mythology, it's just to quote two couples of gods in the Greek mythology. But finally, if we wander in other part of the world, we find nearly the same myth. First couple, so from Hesiod, so some centuries before Plato, at the very beginning of the Greek civilization, in the Theogony, so the creation of the gods themselves. We have the couple of Gaia and Uranus. Gaia is the earth, and Uranus is heaven, sky. And Gaia is really the first to be there. Before Gaia, there is only chaos, night. So, I read the text. And earth first bare starry heaven, equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever sure abiding place for the blessed gods. But afterwards, she lay with heaven and bare deep swelling Oceanus, etc. So you see, the myth of the creation of the world begins with Gaia, the earth, feminine principle by itself, no masculine, and she gave birth by herself to the masculine principle, which is the sky. The sky is her son, and what should not be done is slept with her mother. And the myth very precisely, several times said, and even heaven came, bringing on night and longing for love, and he lay about earth, spreading himself full upon her. You know, it's really a sexual performance, the creation of the world. And from this love in between the two gods, you know, were born all the elements of the world. First monsters like cyclops, giants, etc. But river, mountains, etc. and all the gods. That means to me that the myth tells us that the creation of the world is a product of union of earth and sky. And what the logos usually divide by the horizon line, which divides earth and sky, in the myth they are not divided. On the contrary, they are permanently making love. They are permanently not only in contact, touching, but penetrating. So the horizon line is not just a line, but it's by itself a space, a place. And precisely for us, it's important for us human beings, because we are living precisely on that domain in which sky and earth are meeting every moment of their life, you know, and producing things. And I guess that this is a myth telling us that architecture, finally, the process of producing the shape and the structure of the space in which we are dwelling, is maybe nothing but to give the opportunity to earth and sky to meet and to be comfortable, you know, and to have good condition to do what they love to do, to meet each other, you know, permanently. And so if we give them this opportunity, they will protect us. And so architecture, you know, and even we can completely translate my speech now. And finally, what are you doing when you make a project, you know? You have the foundation underground, and then you are just on the level, and then you try to climb, to reach, to touch the sky. You go up, and you organize the transition in between up and down and up. And that the thickness of our topos, it's not a flat surface, it's a three-dimensional domain in which we dwell, we human beings, but it's precisely the stage that we offer to Gaia and Uranus to perform their what they have to do. And when you have that, you know, when you travel around the world, you realize that a lot of cities, finally, their charm comes from that fact that they are really welcoming this union, this meeting of Gaia and Uranus. And to me, San Francisco, precisely, is maybe the most accurate to do that by this use of the grid pattern, urban pattern, upon a very hilly and slopy territory, topography, which make that half of the streets, you know, are going not perpendicularly to the contour line, and so are forced to confront the slope by the steepest line. And obviously, when you reach the top, you have nothing. You have nothing before to reach the top. You have just the view of the opening of the street framed by the architecture on both sides, you know. And so, San Francisco is offering at every corner, I would say, of its urban territory, the good stage, comfortable for this meeting of Gaia and Uranus. not only in San Francisco. You have that in the French New Town, medieval New Town in southwest part of France, near Toulouse, in which you have these new towns so built according to the grid, also orthogonal grid. And when they are built on top of hills, you have something which is considered from a pure logical point of view absurd and idiot. That means that you have to organize your movement in very difficult condition. That in order not to escape or to soften the slope by making a kind of volute around the slope, but just to provoke it. And the best theoretician of urbanism, they have written that the use of the grid in a territory which is qualified by the slopes of the hills is an absurdity. And it's true from a pure logical point of view, from the pure logos. But from the point of view of the mutos, on the contrary, it's when you do that that you give opportunity to the God to be happy. And when they are happy, it's good for us, because they are kind with us. If they are not happy, they are very bad with us. And when the gods are bad with us, it's not good for us. Second couple, Hestia and Hermes. Hestia is the goddess of the hearth, of the interior. She's the feminine principle. She's keeping the fire, which is the condition of the life. She is at the center. She does not move. And for the mythology, she is making a couple with who? With Hermes. Hermes, the god of the outside, of the movement, of the traveling, of the exchange, always back and forth, never stable, never staying there like Hestia. And for mythology, these qualities of the space, which are in contradiction to each other according to the logical approach, on the contrary, they are complement, And Hestia needs Hermes, and Hermes needs Hestia. And precisely in the text of the Hestia hymn, Homeric hymn to Hestia, Hermes arrives in the text of the myth. So Hestia, in the high dwelling of all, both deathless gods and men who walk on earth, you have gained an everlasting abode and highest honor. Glorious is your portion and your right, etc. And you, so it's in the text devoted to Hestia, and you, slayer of Argus, son of Zeus and Maya, messenger of the blessed gods, bearer of the golden road, giver of good, be favorable and help us, you and Hestia. So this slayer of Argus is Hermes. Come and dwell in the beautiful mansions of the men, in friendship together. So the myth is telling us that Hestia and Hermes can dwell in good relationship to each other when the human beings build beautiful mansions that they offer or that they lend to the god. And you see how much in theory of architecture we consider as contradiction, staying and movement, inside and outside, center and periphery. You see all the consequences of the thought of dividing center and periphery in the, I would say, social urban problems of today, in which we put the quality only to the center and we neglect the periphery, or in a new fashion, we consider only the qualities of the periphery, neglecting the center, which at its turn becomes a sort of periphery from a social point of view, because we never have been able to think them together. Center and periphery, staying, pose, and movement, It's so easy. We have just to read the myth and to respect, to make a favor to the gods. And doing that, they will be happy together, as I say, in friendship together, and they will be protecting us. So, it's true that if we use only the logic concepts and dealing with the space, it's mostly geometry to understand the way the shapes are organized. But if we use only geometry, we are not dealing with the architectural dimension of the structure of the space. We need something else, which does not oppose inside and outside. In geometry, you are forced to define, to delimit a form. It's a square within a plan, two-dimensional plan. And you cannot open the square, the geometrical square. It has to be closed, complete, perfect. In Latin, it was the same word to say the completeness and the perfection. In architecture, if you enclose your shape completely in itself, you are not making an architectural form. In architecture, we need to go outside and to come back inside, or we need to connect, to put in connection. So as soon as you connect, you prevent the pure and mere division, you put in contact. And so thinking architecture only with the, for instance, geometrical logic cannot permit us to really think what we are doing when we are giving a shape to an architectural demand, function, program. So, to make ourselves able to think this complementarity of things, it's not only the content of the myth which is helping us, but it's also the process of thought which is involved in the mythological discourse. This process which considers that the unit is a duality, is a couple. Usually we point only unity. If we are Hegelian, we can consider that unity is produced by thesis and antithesis, by two things becoming one. But the goal is to become one. Unity will explode, and etc. in Hegelian dialectics. But the important moment is the moment of unity. Here, we are forced to think that if we think architecture only with unified concepts, we cannot grasp the meaning. We are forced to use duality as element and not to oppose the features, the qualities of that god to that god, when there are a kind of images of the qualities, features of the space, like in the case of Hestia and Hermes. But we have to think them together. Not to identify them, to unify them. They remain two. They remain different. But the difference is not an opposition. And to think like that, for us, trained since Plato, with the logical process of identification, adequation, delimitation, definition, when we have no definition, we are lost. So how not to be lost in thinking architecture? I would like just to try not to convince you, but to propose an agreement, to show you some images of San Francisco. consider San Francisco as the city of Gaia and Uranus, and in certain sense, I'll try to tell you that story. Los Angeles as the city of Hestia and Hermes. So if we look in that way, we have from Twin Peaks, we have only Market Street, and I would say San Francisco seems similar to any city, I would say, in Europe, a dense fabric from which the street is not opening to nowhere, to the void, but is fronting reality, materiality, not emptiness, not the sky, but remains at the level of the earth. So, a kind of solidity, density of urban reality without emptiness in it. But if we have a different orientation of our vision, we see how the grid is passing over the hills, and obviously we understand how this pattern, urban pattern, will give us the opportunity to feel and to see and to appreciate the presence of the emptiness within the urban fabric. On this first map, you see how since the beginning the city was laid out on a very hilly topography. They knew that will provide difficulties, but nevertheless they expand this system stubbornly. Here, the first layout by the Swiss Viogé at the very moment of the creation of the new San Francisco in the 30s of 19th century. And we see how the little streets, they start at the assault, I would say, to the hill. And we can expect technical problems from that. But maybe what they didn't know, but what they did, they will give the opportunity to Hestia and Hermes, Gaia and Uranus to meet. So this technical problem for circulation, obviously it's easier when it is flat. And well, it's really a provocation, to settle human beings in that conditions. At such a point that Burnham proposed to reform the organization of San Francisco, proposing a system of center with radial boulevard living and bending streets, to affront gently the slope. And so a very sophisticated plan which had transformed completely the organization of San Francisco. But they didn't, for various reasons, they didn't realize that. So in his plan, you see, that was the end of Market Street when it touched the foot of the Twin Peaks. So you see, the contrary of the San Franciscan street, which is leading to nowhere, here you are fronting not only the mountain that you give up to pass, but you settle a big Beaux-Arts composition, closing the view. And that means that the boulevard is a frame to focus the attention, the view, toward the object that you celebrate, which is contradictory with the spirit of the urban street. You see how in that scheme he blocks, he shuts, he celebrates, but it's not from San Francisco. And this proposal for Telegraph Hill, so the first hill in San Francisco to be inhabited, and the top, is transformed in a platform. And you see the bending street kind of volute, climbing gently the hill. That was the logic, I would say. That was the spirit of the Logos, Logos not understanding the possibilities of the Topos, of the contact of the grid with the geography, producing a very rich urban topos. Here we have a logical proposal. And so that's the very top of Montgomery Street, on top of Telegraph. And you see that not even the very top, they didn't make it flat. We have the memory of the hill, the roundness of the top of the hill, as if we were tangent on that point to the globe, the earth as a sphere. Usually we perceive the sphere as flat, as linear. But some holy place, and to me the top of Telegraph Hill is one of these holy places, we have the contact. See that the view on the other direction. Burnham wanted to make that flat and perfect. Obviously, it's not very convenient, but it's much more enriching the perception of the world that we can have when we are there. And from nearly the same place, the crossing of Montgomery with Union Street, going down and up to the top of Nob Hill, and the openings repeated on top of every parallel street. And so here you can see how much the contact of the sky and the earth is not the horizontal and linear line, extended, stretched, but on the contrary, it's a very tight line which is in between, because the earth is going above this horizontal line. So we see precisely earth penetrating within the sky, penetrating within the earth. And so the city is so generous, to the God, to give them all these opportunity to meet, but to us, to share this big meeting, cosmical meeting. So you American, you are very much accustomed to that, but when we European, we discovered that, the first moment, they are mad, or they are idiot. And finally, but they are connected with the Greek mythology much more than us in our very ancient and antique places. And here, even I was there on top of the Stockton parking lot. I took the photo, and when I came back in Europe, I saw the third dimension, the black mouse opening onto the third dimension of hell. And I say, well, they are even more clever than I thought, because there is the sky, there is the earth, and there is the underground energy, But it's really true that sky is covering his mother in every part. That means even when you pierce the earth, behind what you have, it's still Uranus, And so Los Angeles, more quickly because, I am just discovering Los Angeles, and I would like so much to work with some of you interested in these issues. So, little gentle Mexican Los Angeles from Bunker Hill, Pico House, and the Church of Santa Maria, etc. And what happens when American came? Okay. You see, you recognize in middle of that plan, the plan of Mexican Los Angeles, and on both sides, north being on the right side of the slide, the project of Lieutenant Ord. So the new American city, since the beginning, is divided in two parts. In between, nearly empty, the memory of the Mexican city and the dense fabric of the new town, on two sides of a kind of empty center. That means since the beginning for me, Los Angeles is conceived as something which has to connect. Because that the first new project, is very strong. It's very, I would say, respectful of what does exist. But when you had the power of the American army, etc., you could have conceived your new city with a strong unity, a strong unified starting point. No, he preferred, to have two sides of the city, southern one, northern one. Even he didn't organize the two sides with the same orientation. Yes, he used the same grid pattern, even the same dimension, but not the same orientation. That means that since the beginning, Los Angeles is divided with itself. So certainly he would add to connect. And to me, this structure, the first seed being divided, and so necessarily you have to connect. You prepare yourself to be a territory in which the connection will be the important features of your urban structure. Sometime after, Hancock proposed a new grid, new organization to complete the first proposal by Ord. Different size, different orientation. That means that you are reinforcing the necessity to connect. Because you settle a kind of disjunction instead of settling the conjunction. Why not to continue to develop? Like in San Francisco, they start at the bottom of Telegraph Hill and they expand continuously, homogeneously. No problem of the hills. Here, they had less topographical problem, and nevertheless, they didn't propose a single logical pattern. So, in Los Angeles, since the beginning, you will be obliged to find and to put the emphasis on communication. And if we add around 1910 the arrival of the Jefferson grid on central Los Angeles going to the south, on the left side of the image, that plan that you know better than me, you add to what you added already as a differentiation in the organization of the urban fabric. Now we have a correct north-south orientation, but as all the other grids were not oriented like this one, you will certainly be forced to find something. And that's why, to me, Los Angeles is so rich in different meanings of communication. That means it's a paradise for Hermes. Maybe not at the rush hours, but most of the time. You know, if you like to move, that's the place to be. To be, if I may say to be, because to be, if you move, is not to stay. But finally, you see this little scheme showing the railways network in 1880 something, you know. So nearly since the beginning, the urban territory is conceived as a network connecting different points. That means that you have Hestia also. Hestia can have her favorite places to stay at home. You know, at the crossing, at the knot of the big network of communication, of ways of communication, you can set what we call in French demeure, a place to stay, where we dwell, or habitation in habitation is a place in which we stay. As you say, where do you stay? But in French, maybe it sounds more sensible. This notion of the well. So Hermes, obviously, apparently, is dominating the logic or the sensible logic of Los Angeles. But being careful enough, we find a lot of places for Hestia. And I used to live at friends in Venice, you know. But if you live in many, many places of Los Angeles, even if they are neighborhood in which poor people are living, nevertheless, if you compare their condition of living to the one of some French suburbs, you know, in which also people without employment, without hopes, are living, it's absolutely different. Just because here you have this possibility to stay and to move, as if all the development of the city since the very beginning of the Lieutenant Hall has been conceived as a device appropriate to good relationship in between Hestia and Hermes. So for you, it's absolutely banal, this view. But for us to conceive that it is an urban freeway, it's incredible, you know, to mix these techniques of transportation with the idea of not the center, but of the urban inside, you know. It's something which is difficult to conceive for us. But you are accustomed, you know, you are a friend of Hermes. And you have different layers of this transportation device. You have the wonderful boulevard of the 30s. And also something less formal, like La Brea all these streets in between the great way of transportation and something which is more humble. And then in the rich neighborhood here, it is Hancock Park, you have a very sophisticated organization, much more intimate than the boulevard, obviously. But you can have, finally, the same structure of the space, same organization of the public domain, private, etc., in areas in which really you have really humble people living there. So Hermes is in Los Angeles, and Hestia too. Or, I don't know if it is true, obviously, but it's what we have, I think, we have to consider if we want to understand the way Los Angeles is working. And to come back and to finish with contemporary architecture, you recognize, obviously, Salk Institute in San Diego by Cannes. And if we follow that little water canal, very contemporary architecture, not quite contemporary, because contemporariness is something which disappears as soon it is pronounced. But if we let it span a little bit, we have absolutely this conception of what is the essence of architecture, which is to give a stage to Gaia and Uranus in that case. And the human figure could be very weak in that ambiance. We have to be careful because it's not quite for us, it's for the gods, you know. So it's not there in the piazza that we have to dwell in the Salk Institute. We have to go inside to work and to win Nobel Prize, you know. But nevertheless, we are invited, you know, to sneak in and not to disturb the gods making love, you know, and producing the world. And so Cannes, I guess, is one of the greatest because even without telling the myth, you know, he was performing the myth. We are not obliged to believe him, to believe in his architecture. But when you are there, when I was there, I've been kept. So mythology can be very contemporary. Some people are maybe in better condition to understand that. The artist, the painter, Wayne Thiebaud, representing San Francisco, you see even the colors, you know, are nearly the same to depict the sky and the earth, except for the street macadam itself. But the same importance given to what is above and what is underneath the horizon line. Diebenkorn, not very far from here, Ocean Park. And once again, you know, this presence of this space, not the horizon as a line, but as a space, sky penetrating into the level of the earth. And the greatest of the greatest, Rothko, which said many times, you know, I am a realistic painter. I am not interested in abstraction. So people said, oh, okay, you are painting landscape. Oh, come on, because it's true. It could be a landscape, you know, remember Turner or something like that, the haze. First of all, the format is not the one of a landscape, because the natural landscape is horizontal properly. I mean, it's stretched horizontally. Roscoe's paintings are vertically organized. And he said, no, I can't go to the countryside, it's boring for me. I'm very, malheureux, unhappy when I am not in New York, in my dear Manhattan. And what I think, it's not natural landscape, which is the meaning behind this painting, but it is precisely the urban landscape that we could see in San Francisco, but elsewhere as well. This fundamental, I would say, situation of the human being in front of that stage which is offered. And so I think that Roscoe was right when he said, I am realistic, and secondly, I am not showing natural landscape. He didn't say that he was in contact or dealing with the urban landscape. But to me, the meaning of his work is to remind us at every moment of our life that the urban scene or the city is a scene for this meeting of Gaia and Uranus. Voilà.